History can become forgotten for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's just overshadowed by other events. Other times it's lost because the people who witnessed it are gone before it's ever written down or reaches a channel that you might hear. And of course, much history is simply lost by the weight of time. But sometimes history is lost deliberately. It's repressed, censored by people in power who don't want you to hear it for numerous reasons, including perhaps to prevent World War III. And thus, a very interesting piece of history. The longest dogfight in the history of US Naval aviation was lost within the closest held secrets of the Cold War for more than 60 years. And yet it is history that deserves to be remembered. The connection between the Soviet Union and the war in Korea was complex. The Soviets were never technically involved in the war, and yet at the time the war would have been impossible without their support. The Soviet Union could have prevented the UN intervention, but chose instead to boycott the Security Council over recognition of Red China, who was fully involved in the war. Soviets supplied weapons and support, making Korea perhaps the quintessential example of a proxy war. And though not admitted at the time, Soviet pilots participated directly in the war, albeit under the guise of the Chinese Air Force. But in November of 1952, Soviet pilots in Soviet MiGs became directly involved in the war, a fact that neither side wanted to admit. Zhang Xiaoming, an associate professor of history at Texas A&M International University, wrote in a 2013 edition of the Journal of Conflict Studies, "Indeed, the war-waging capabilities of the People's Republic of China were limited, and its efforts in Korea depended on Soviet equipment, Soviet advice, and particularly Soviet air support. Recent revelations of Chinese and former Soviet archival records demonstrate a deep involvement of the Soviet Union on the Communist side in the Korean War, especially the Soviet Air Force units and other military personnel that were actively participating in the fight against the U.S. and its allies." This was a matter of necessity, technical writer Mitch Williamson notes on the website warhistory.org. Short of equipment and lacking combat experience, China and North Korea were unable to overcome UN air superiority and fulfill even their limited role. It soon became clear that unless the Soviet Union became involved, the Americans and their allies would dominate the skies over Korea. For reasons of secrecy, all aircraft carried Chinese insignia, and Soviet pilots dressed in Chinese uniforms and were even assigned Chinese pseudonyms. They were instructed to speak Chinese or Korean over the air, and personal conversations were forbidden. Retired U.S. Navy Captain Mark Liebman writes in a 2022 edition of Military History Now, 4 Soviet Air Force fighter divisions of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps deployed to air bases in the People's Republic of China, near the mouth of the Yalu River on the western edge of the peninsula. Equipped with state-of-the-art MiG-15s, they were there to support the North Korean People's Army, as well as the PRC's People Liberation Army. Almost every day, Soviet MiGs engaged F-86 Sabres from the 4th, 18th, and 51st Fighter Interceptor Wings over the mouth of the Yalu River on the west side of the Korean peninsula. Encounters with the new and deadly MiG-15 in that area around the Yalu River on the western side of the peninsula became so common that the area became known as MiG Alley. There, the MiGs frequently clashed with the North American F-86 Sabre jets of the U.S. Air Force, but the first encounters with the MiG-15 were with a different jet, operated by the Navy, the Grumman F-9F Panther. Military historian Sebastian Roblin writes in a 2022 edition of The National Interest, "After World War II, the U.S. Navy scrambled to field its own jet fighters, but designing a warplane that could fly dramatically faster while still landing on a short carrier deck proved a challenge. Like the P-80 Shooting Star, the U.S. Air Force's first jet fighter in operational service, Grumman's new design retained a traditional straight-wing configuration that limited its performance when approaching the speed of sound. The Grumman designers appreciated the need for naval aircraft to be rugged to withstand harsh flat-top landings and conditions at sea. The Panther had folding wings to ease storage on crowded decks and introduced new pilot-pleasing features such as ejection seats and a pressurized cockpit. The MiG-15 was a lighter, swept-wing design. The MiG had better high-altitude performance than the Panther and P-80 and was faster by 100 miles per hour. The Panther, however, had its advantages, Roblin continues. Though clearly outclassed, the Panther was more maneuverable at certain altitudes and possessed a superior amount of 4 20mm M3 Hispano cannons in the nose. The rapid-firing guns could spit out 16 pounds of high-explosive shells a second, with ammunition for 13 seconds of sustained fire. The MiG-15 was a more unstable gun platform with two 23mm cannons and one 37mm. The latter was exceptionally hard-hitting, but its low velocity limited its accuracy versus nimble fighters. The first air-to-air battles between jet fighters would be between these two aircraft. Naval reservist Ryan Gilchrist writes in the Annals of the US Naval Institute Press in 2021. On 9 November, a joint strike on the bridges spanning the Yalu River by Carrier Air Group 5 and Carrier Air Group 11 was carried out with air cover provided by the Air Wing's respective Panther units. Lieutenant Commander William T. Amen, commanding officer of the fighter squadron VF-111, was one of the Panther pilots covering the strike from the Philippine Sea. While looking for bandits, Amen's division was alerted to a fast-moving jet approaching from astern. Without the slightest hesitation, the Panthers turned to meet the threat and spotted a silver MiG-15. The MiG was faster, but as the Panthers fired short bursts, the MiG made turns along the F-9Fs to close the gap. The MiG then went into a dive, and Amen followed him down, firing all the way. When his subsonic Panther began to buffet from the speed, Amen ceased shooting and pulled up with only 200 feet to spare, as the MiG flew into a hillside. Lieutenant Commander Amen scored the first jet-versus-jet kill not only for the Navy, but the first in history. However, the swept-wing Air Force F-86 was clearly a better match for the MiG-15, and the Navy's Panther was quickly moved away from dogfighting with MiGs. Journalist Max Hopman writes in a 2022 edition of the military magazine Task and Purpose. While the Navy had scored some early kills against the MiGs, their mission had switched to one of mostly ground attack. That was particularly true on the other side of the peninsula, outside of MiG Alley. Liebman explains that in the Sea of Japan, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 77 roamed up and down the coast. Generally, its carriers and escorts launched close air support and interdiction strikes from within 50 miles of the coast to cut off supplies to the People's Liberation Army and what was left of the Korean People's Army. These attacks were generally too far away from the bases in China for the MiGs to operate. Thus the surprise when Lieutenant Royce Williams encountered a group of MiGs on the Sea of Japan side of Korea outside of MiG Alley on November 18, 1952. Liebman writes, by 1952, the Navy was rotating 3 Essex-class carriers it had in theater, so 2 carriers were on station off the east coast of Korea, with a third refitting, rearming in Japan. On November 18, 1952, the U.S. Oriskany was off of the north coast of North Korea, about 50 miles east of Chongjin, and less than 100 miles southwest of the Soviet air and naval bases at Vladivostok. Journalist Pam Cragen writes of Williams in a 2022 edition of the San Diego Union Tribune. From their early childhood in South Dakota, Williams said that he and his brother dreamed of growing up to fly airplanes. They got their wish after enlisting for war duty in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. Williams was still in flight training when World War II ended, but he stayed in the Navy, and while finishing up a college degree in Minnesota, the Korean conflict began. After training to fly the F-9F-5 Panther jet, Williams shipped overseas and was eventually assigned to provide air support for a fleet of carriers off the North Korean coastal city of Chongjin, about 100 miles south of the Russian city of Vladivostok. Kagan continues that on November 18, 1952, Williams said he and 3 other Panther pilots were assigned to do combat air patrol along the Yalu River, which separated the North Korean and Soviet territories. At the time, the Soviets weren't involved in the war and were not seen as a threat, but they had been sending more planes into the skies to protect their airspace. But there was something rather more to it than that, as this was not just a routine patrol. Liebman writes that on board Oriskany, the task force commander received a top-secret message indicating that MiGs were expected to fly south from Vladivostok and over Task Force 77. Where did the message come from? Williams and his superiors wouldn't have known at the time, but Liebman writes that it came from an organization that did not yet officially exist. We now know the message to USS Oriskany warning of the MiG flight came from a National Security Agency, NSA team on board the heavy cruiser USS Toledo. More than likely, the intelligence that was used to launch Williams came from a communications intercept. At the time, the mere existence of the newly formed NSA was still considered top secret, which earned it the moniker No Such Agency. In any case, 4 F-9Fs of Squadron VF-781 were sent to intercept. As Liebman writes, standard U.S. Navy doctrine was then, as it is today, to intercept any intruder before they reach their weapon launch envelope and escort them until they depart. What happened that day? Well, for 62 years, officially, nothing. But that all changed in 2014 with the publication of Red Devils over Yalu, a chronicle of Soviet aerial operations in the Korean War, by Russian historian Igor Saidov. In his book, Saidov described a serious international incident between MiG-15s of the Soviet Air Force and Navy F-9Fs, and he mentioned Lieutenant Williams by name. The 6-decade-old silence had been broken, and Williams was still around to tell the story. The weather that day was terrible, Liebman writes. On top of the heavy snowfall that blanketed Task Force 77 ships, the air temperature was in the 20s and the water temperature was in the mid-30s. The 4 planes would quickly realize how dangerous the threat was. Kagan writes that while climbing through snow clouds below 12,000 feet, Williams said he and his patrol group learned that 7 unknown aircraft were approaching at high elevation. And the issue wasn't just that the 4 were meeting 7. Kagan writes, meanwhile, the captain of the 4-plane U.S. patrol experienced an engine problem, so he and his wingman returned to the ship, leaving Williams and his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade John D. Middleton, behind. As the unidentified planes flew overhead, Williams recognized them as Soviet MiG-15s. This was significant. While UN pilots had long suspected that Soviet pilots were operating MiGs with Chinese insignia in MiG Alley, Williams was on the Sea of Japan side of the peninsula. This was one indication that let Williams know, Hauptmann writes, the planes he was facing were almost certainly launched from the Soviet Union. The action quickly became hot, Liebman explains. The 2 F-9Fs broke out in the clear at 12,000 feet and were climbing past 16,000 feet when Williams spotted the enemy's contrails, 45 miles from the carrier. He estimated the Soviet fighters to be above 30,000 feet higher. Williams kept climbing and radioed to the Riskany that he had a tally-ho on the MiGs, which were split into 3-plane and 4-plane sections. Both were now diving on the 2 F-9Fs from different directions. The CIC on board Riskany radioed Williams not to engage when suddenly the MiGs opened fire with their 23mm and 37mm cannons. With tracers streaming past his F-9F-5, Williams replied as he made sure his cannons were armed and ready to fire. "We are already engaged." Quickly, the Navy pilots saw an opportunity. Hauptmann writes, as Williams and his wingmen climbed past 26,000 feet, the MiGs split into 2 formations, with 4 of them diving and firing towards the Navy jets from Williams' 10 o'clock. Williams turned and pulled towards the MiG formation, firing a burst at the tail-end Charlie of the group. It fell away, marking Williams' first kill of the day. But the odds quickly shifted again, as Liebman explains. Both Middleton and Williams fired a short burst at the MiG. Pieces flew off the Soviet fighter, and the fighter began to smoke as it dove past. Middleton followed the damaged MiG down to finish it off, but couldn't. All 4 of his plane's 20mm cannons jammed. Williams ordered Middleton to fly back to the Oriskany. Kagan writes, suddenly Williams found himself facing the incomprehensibly long odds of surviving a 7-versus-1 encounter, meaning 7 planes against 1. He describes the next 35 minutes as a never-ending battle of strategy and constant maneuvering to avoid being hit from behind, while taking the occasional shot whenever it presented itself. He said he was so busy thinking, he never had time to get scared. The odds were long indeed, given not just the numbers, but the different capabilities of the plane. Liebman explains Williams was now alone in a dogfight against 6 MiG-15s, each of which had an 80-knot advantage in level flight over his aircraft and a much higher rate of climb. For Williams, a vertical fight was one he knew he would lose. But the Panther had an advantage over the MiGs in its ability to turn, and Williams used that advantage. Liebman continues. The Soviet MiGs were now rocketing above Williams to make another diving pass. Each time a MiG shot at his tail, he rolled the F-9F into a tight turn, forcing the MiGs to overshoot. Quickly, another opportunity arose, Liebman writes. As one crossed in front of him, he fired an almost 90-degree deflection shot. The rounds hit home as the chunks came off the MiG. The pilot ejected. He did not, however, have the luxury to celebrate the victory. Military aviation writer Dario Leone writes in a 2020 edition of the Aviation Geek Club. After he shot down the first MiG, Williams couldn't confirm his kills. I was too busy to start counting. I would fire at a plane and then someone else would be on my tail and I had to maneuver and I couldn't tell what happened to the plane I shot, he recalls. In fact, he wasn't even thinking of scoring kills. He told the Union Tribune, I was engaged mentally at the time. A lot of it was awareness of where they were and how I was to maneuver to avoid them. They were taking turns. I decided if I concentrated on shooting them down, then I'd become an easy target. So my initial goal was to look for defensive opportunities when they made mistakes. And he had to be careful with those, Hauptmann explains, because the Panther carried less ammunition than the MiGs. Williams had to choose his shots carefully. "In the moment I was a fighter pilot doing my job," said Williams. "I was only shooting what I had." Liebman explains Williams, his head on a swivel, continued to dodge the MiGs. Another passed below him and pulled up in front of his F-9F. Williams instinctively moved the controls to put the pipper on the gun sight on the enemy and pressed the trigger. His 420mm cannon spoke, and the MiG-15 exploded. Then another. Liebman continues. Several turns later, another MiG-15 dove straight at Williams, who rolled out of a turn and climbed to meet the threat. The longer-range cannon on the MiG allowed its pilot to fire first, but the shells passed below the F-9F. Once in range, Williams fired and could see flashes from his 20mm shells hitting the MiG. It went straight down, smoking. But Williams couldn't finish the kill, as Liebman explains. Williams' guns suddenly fell silent. He was out of ammunition. And that was not the only problem. Hauptmann writes, in more than 30 minutes of aerial combat, Williams had downed at least 3 of the MiGs, with a 4th one heavily damaged. His plane, though, had suffered plenty of damage of its own. Still being pursued, he headed for the clouds. Liebman writes, Williams dove to the clouds, whose tops were about 12,000 feet, hoping to get away. The remaining MiGs chased his diving F-9F, their guns blazing. A 37mm shell hit in the accessory section of the American's jet engine. The explosion severed Williams' rudder cables and knocked out his hydraulics, leaving him with limited elevator and aileron control. A barrage of 23mm cannon shells were fired at Williams' F-9F. Several hit his jet as he used the elevator to porpoise the fighter erratically to dodge the MiG shells. Once in the clouds, Williams now had to fly the plane on instruments. Free of the MiGs, he descended until he broke out below the clouds, at just 400 feet. It was now a struggle to get his crippled plane back to the Oriskany. Hauptmann writes, diving low into the clouds, Williams considered ejecting, but decided to keep flying. "I knew in that weather I wouldn't have survived in the time it took to find me," he said. It wasn't an easy landing. Damage to his plane meant that it started to stall below 170 knots, while the landing speed for the F-9F was typically 120 knots. But he managed to land and then saw the condition of his plane. Hauptmann writes, on deck there were 263 holes counted in Williams' Panther, although he never saw it again. It was supposedly pushed off the deck into the sea, with the gun camera footage being taken away for analysis. The robust nature of the Grumman plane is thought to be one of the reasons that Williams could survive the lopsided fight. The damage he had done to the Soviet Air Force wasn't clear until Saidov published his book in 2014. He wrote that of the 7 MiGs that left Vladivostok that morning, only 1 returned to base. 4 were shot down by a single U.S. aircraft. 1 plane was shot up and crashed on its way back, and the 7th plane was never found. Navy veteran Steve Lewandowski told the Union Tribune, Williams' air battle is now known as the longest dogfight in naval history. Before that, the longest one was 5 minutes. Lewandowski said, even in the most extreme circumstances, pilots know that if you can run, you run, and you only ever train for 3-on-1. To go 7-on-1 is beyond imagining. But what California Congressman Darrell Issel called, to this day, the most unique U.S.-Soviet aerial dogfight in the history of the Cold War, and one that was truly for the ages, had a problem. U.S. planes had directly fought Soviet planes, an event that could spark a war between the two superpowers that nobody wanted. Saidov wrote, the two exchanged notes of protest, and then the event was quickly forgotten, and all the materials associated with it were classified. Williams was told never to speak of the event. Ever. Even to his wife. When he met President Eisenhower, the two did not discuss the extraordinary dogfight that officially never occurred. He kept the secret through another 26 years of service, including 110 combat missions over Vietnam, finally retiring in the mid-1970s with the rank of captain. If it weren't for the Russians releasing documents after the fall of the Soviet Union, the longest dogfight in the history of US naval aviation might simply have become forgotten history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.